The morning Sarah Whitmore hung her grandmother's wedding quilt on the clothesline, she had no idea a stranger would ride 30 miles through treacherous canyon country just to return it to her doorstep. She clipped the final corner to the rope stretched between two weathered posts behind her small house on the outskirts of Esperanza, Texas, a town barely large enough to warrant a dot on most maps in the spring of 1882. The quilt was a magnificent thing, pieced together with fabrics from her grandmother's own wedding dress and shirts her grandfather had worn during their courtship back in Tennessee before they headed west. Deep burgundy patches mingled with cream-colored cotton, forest green calico, and small squares of blue gingham that reminded Sarah of summer skies. Her grandmother had stitched it in the winter of 1845, and Sarah's mother had carried it all the way to Texas when the family settled here 15 years ago. Sarah stepped back to admire how the quilt looked in the bright April sunshine, its colors vivid against the pale desert landscape. At 23 years old, she lived alone now in the house her father had built, the house where she had grown up with her two brothers and baby sister. Her parents had died 3 years ago when a fever swept through Esperanza, taking 12 souls in the span of 2 weeks. Her brothers had moved to California seeking gold and fortune, while her sister had married a merchant and relocated to San Antonio. Sarah had stayed behind, unable to abandon the land her father had worked so hard to cultivate, the small vegetable garden her mother had tended, and the memories embedded in every sun-bleached board of the house. She made her living taking in sewing and mending for the townspeople, her nimble fingers creating intricate embroidery on shirts and dresses, repairing torn work clothes, and occasionally crafting a special garment for weddings or church services. The work kept her fed and gave her enough to pay the occasional hired hand to help maintain the property, though money was always tight, and she had learned to stretch every penny until it practically screamed for mercy. The wind had been calm that morning when she carried the heavy quilt outside in her washing basket. She had scrubbed it carefully in her largest tub, using soap she had made herself from lye and fat. Working the suds gently through the precious fabric, the quilt only got washed twice a year, and Sarah always chose days when the weather seemed most cooperative. She had checked the sky repeatedly, seeing nothing but endless blue stretching from horizon to horizon, not a single cloud to suggest rain or storm. But the desert had a way of changing its mind without warning. Sarah went inside to start on her sewing orders, settling into the rocking chair by the window where the light was best. She had 3 shirts to mend, a dress to take in at the waist, and a christening gown to embroider for the banker's new granddaughter. Her needle moved in and out of the white linen as she created delicate roses and vines along the gown's collar, her mind wandering to thoughts of whether she would ever have children of her own to stitch for. She had received proposals over the years. Thomas Yates, who ran the feed store, had asked for her hand twice. Martin Schiller, a widower with 4 children, had suggested she might want a ready-made family. Even old Howard Perkins, who had to be 60 if he was a day, had hinted broadly that a woman alone needed a man to take care of things. But Sarah had turned them all down, unable to imagine binding herself to someone she did not love, unable to picture waking up each morning beside a man who made her heart feel nothing more than polite friendship or mild tolerance. Her mother had told her once, the year before she died, that she should not settle for anything less than the kind of love that made the world seem brighter just because that person existed in it. Her parents had shared that kind of love, the kind that showed in small glances across the dinner table, in the way her father's hand would find her mother's shoulder as he passed behind her chair, in how they could communicate entire conversations with just a raised eyebrow or slight smile. Sarah wanted that, or she wanted nothing at all. The wind began as a whisper around noon, a gentle stirring that made the curtains dance at the open window. Sarah glanced outside, noting the quilt swaying slightly on the line, but felt no concern. By early afternoon, though, the whisper had grown to a steady breath, and by 3 o'clock, it was howling like something alive and angry. Sarah set down her sewing and hurried to the window, her stomach dropping as she watched dust devils spin across the scrubland beyond her fence. She ran outside, her skirts whipping around her legs, her dark hair tearing free from its careful bun. The wind slapped her face with grit and made her eyes water. She reached the clothesline just in time to see one corner of the quilt rip free from its pin. She lunged for it, her fingers grasping at air as another corner came loose. The quilt billowed like a sail, And for one desperate moment, Sarah had both hands on the fabric, pulling hard, fighting the wind's greedy grip. Then the third pin gave way, and the wind won. The quilt soared upward, a brilliant flash of burgundy and cream and green against the brown landscape, tumbling end over end as the wind carried it east, away from town, toward the broken canyon country that stretched for miles. Sarah ran after it, screaming wordlessly, her feet pounding the hard-packed earth. She ran until her lungs burned and her side ached, watching helplessly as the quilt sailed over the fence marking her property line, over the ridge where Joshua trees grew in twisted shapes, disappearing into the vast emptiness beyond. She stopped finally, bent double, gasping for breath, tears streaming down her dusty cheeks. The quilt was gone, her grandmother's wedding quilt, the last tangible piece of her family's history. The thing she treasured most in the world had been snatched away by indifferent wind and was now somewhere in the wilderness, probably caught on a cactus or torn to shreds on sharp rocks. Sarah walked slowly back to her house, feeling as though something vital had been carved out of her chest. Inside, she sank into her rocking chair and let herself cry properly, great shaking sobs that left her exhausted and empty. When the tears finally stopped, she sat staring at nothing, watching the light fade as evening approached, unable to muster the energy to light a lamp or start preparing supper. She had no way of knowing that her quilt had traveled nearly 15 miles before snagging on an outcropping of rock near Bitter Creek, where it hung like a colorful flag visible for a considerable distance. She had no way of knowing that a cowboy riding the fence line of the Broken Arrow Ranch would spot that flash of color just before sunset and ride over to investigate, curious about what civilized thing had ended up in such a desolate spot. His name was Jesse Tanner, and he was 26 years old, lean and weather-worn from 6 years of working cattle in the harsh Texas landscape. He had sandy brown hair that needed cutting, gray eyes that could spot a stray calf at a quarter mile, and a quiet manner that made people think he was slow until they realized he simply preferred to think before speaking. He had grown up on a small ranch in New Mexico territory until his father lost everything in a drought, and Jesse had been drifting from job to job ever since, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots, never quite able to shake the restless feeling that somewhere else might offer something better. He had been working at the Broken Arrow for 8 months, the longest he had stayed anywhere since leaving home. The ranch belonged to a man named Fletcher Gray, who ran cattle and horses on 20,000 acres of land that ranged from decent grazing to rocky wasteland. Jesse worked hard, drew his pay, and kept mostly to himself, eating with the other ranch hands but rarely joining in their card games or trips into town. The other cowboys considered him odd but reliable, the kind of man you wanted beside you when rounding up spooked cattle in a thunderstorm, but not necessarily the kind you would invite to share a bottle of whiskey. Jesse had ridden out that afternoon to check a section of fence that had been damaged by javelinas, the wild pigs that roamed the area. He had made the necessary repairs, stacking rocks to reinforce the base of the posts, and was heading back toward the ranch headquarters when he spotted the quilt. At first he thought it might be a wounded animal, the colors strange against the monotone landscape, but as he rode closer, he realized what it was. He dismounted and carefully untangled the fabric from the rocks, noting the fine stitching and the quality of the handiwork. This was not some cheap blanket tossed away carelessly. This was something made with love and skill, something that mattered to somebody. He examined it carefully in the fading light, relieved to see that, while dusty and slightly snagged in one corner, the quilt was essentially undamaged. The wind must have carried it here, he reasoned, but from where? Jesse looked around, trying to determine wind direction and trajectory. The wind had been blowing from the west all afternoon, hard and steady. He turned his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Rusty, and began riding slowly westward, scanning the landscape. 15 miles or more, he estimated. The quilt could have come from any number of ranches or homesteads scattered across this part of Texas, but something in Jesse felt compelled to try and find its owner. He could not say exactly why. Perhaps it was because he understood what it meant to lose something precious. Perhaps it was simply because returning lost things was the right action to take. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, some instinct he did not yet understand, pulling him in a specific direction. It was too late and too dark to start searching now. Jesse carefully folded the quilt and secured it behind his saddle, then rode back to the ranch. In the bunkhouse, he stowed the quilt in his footlocker, ignoring the curious glances from the other hands. He would ask around tomorrow, he decided. Someone might know who was missing a quilt, or he could ride into Esperanza, the nearest town, and inquire there. That night he lay in his bunk and found himself thinking about the unknown person who had made that quilt, imagining hands moving patiently through all those tiny stitches, choosing colors and arranging patterns. He thought about how that person must be feeling right now, having lost something so clearly valuable. The thought bothered him more than he would have expected, keeping him awake long after the other men had started snoring. The next morning was Sunday, which meant lighter work around the ranch. Jesse approached Mr. Gray after breakfast and asked if he could ride into town. The rancher, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a salt and pepper beard, shrugged his consent. Jesse saddled Rusty, retrieved the quilt from his footlocker, and set out for Esperanza. The town was 12 miles from the Broken Arrow, nestled in a shallow valley where a creek provided year-round water. Jesse had been there a handful of times for supplies, but had never paid much attention to the place. It consisted of one main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, a bank, a livery stable, and maybe 20 houses scattered on the outskirts. He tied Rusty outside the general store and went in, the quilt draped over his arm. The store was run by a woman named Martha Henley, a formidable person who seemed to know everything that happened within 50 miles. She looked up from her counter when Jesse entered, her sharp eyes immediately fixing on the quilt. "Well now," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the small space. "That is Sarah Whitmore's grandmother's quilt, unless I have gone completely blind." Jesse felt something catch in his chest at the name, though he could not have said why. "Sarah Whitmore," he repeated. "Lives about 2 miles west of town," Martha said, coming around the counter to touch the quilt with careful fingers. "Poor girl has had nothing but hardship these last few years. Lost her parents, her siblings all scattered. She does sewing for folks to get by. This quilt means the world to her. Where did you find it?" "Caught on rocks out near Bitter Creek," Jesse said. "The wind must have taken it yesterday." Martha shook her head sympathetically. "That wind was fierce. I am sure she is beside herself. You are from the Broken Arrow, are you not, Jesse Tanner?" He nodded, slightly surprised she knew his name. But then, that seemed to be the nature of small towns. Everyone knew everyone, or at least knew of them. "That is good of you to bring it all this way," Martha said warmly. "Sarah lives in a small house, white with blue shutters, on the West Road. You cannot miss it. It is the only place out that way with a windmill." Jesse thanked her and left the store, his mind already turning over this new information. Sarah Whitmore, a woman alone who did sewing work, who had lost her parents and whose siblings had left, who treasured this quilt enough that its loss would devastate her. He remounted Rusty and rode west out of town, following the road until he spotted the house Martha had described. It sat alone against the endless sky, looking small and vulnerable, the windmill beside it, creaking as its blades turned. Jesse felt his heartbeat quicken as he approached, though he told himself that was ridiculous. He was simply returning lost property. There was no reason to feel nervous. He tied Rusty to the fence post and walked to the front door, the quilt over his arm. He knocked and waited, hearing movement inside. When the door opened, Jesse felt as though the wind had knocked the air from his lungs. Sarah Whitmore was not beautiful in the conventional sense that men usually described. She was too thin, her cheekbones too sharp, her mouth too wide, but her eyes were the deep brown of rich earth, intelligent and expressive, and her dark hair, though pulled back in a simple style, gleamed with health. She wore a plain gray dress with a white apron, and her hands, Jesse noticed, were elegant and capable looking, the hands of someone who created things. But it was not her appearance that struck him so forcefully. It was something else, something in her expression as she looked at him with wary curiosity, something in the way she held herself, straight-backed and dignified despite obvious poverty, that made him feel as though he had been searching for something his entire life without knowing it, and had just now found it standing in this doorway. Sarah, for her part, saw a cowboy on her doorstep, holding something that made her heart lurch violently in her chest. She saw her grandmother's quilt, unmistakable with its burgundy and cream and green patches, draped over the arm of a stranger who looked at her with startling gray eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "My quilt," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Yes, ma'am," Jesse said. Finding his voice, though, it came out rougher than he intended. "Found it caught on some rocks out near Bitter Creek. Figured someone would be missing it. Sarah reached out with trembling hands, taking the quilt from him, hugging it to her chest as tears spilled down her cheeks. She did not care that she was crying in front of a stranger. She had thought this quilt was lost forever, gone where she could never recover it. And here it was, returned to her arms as though by some miracle. "I thought it was gone," she said, her voice breaking. "The wind took it yesterday and I could not catch it, and I thought I would never see it again." Jessie stood awkwardly, unsure what to do in the face of such raw emotion. "It is a bit dusty," he said, "and there is a small snag on one corner, but mostly it is fine." Sarah laughed through her tears, a sound that Jessie thought might be the loveliest thing he had ever heard. "Dust I can clean," she said, "and I can mend the snag. Oh, you have no idea what this means to me. This was my grandmother's wedding quilt. It is all I have left of her, of my whole family, really. How can I ever thank you?" "No thanks needed," Jessie said quickly. "I was just doing what anyone would do." Sarah shook her head firmly. "No, not anyone would ride all this way to return something to a stranger. Please, will you come in? Let me at least offer you some coffee and something to eat." Jessie hesitated, but something in her earnest expression made refusal impossible. "I would not want to impose," he said. "It is not an imposition," Sarah insisted, stepping back to open the door wider. "Please, I insist." Jessie entered the small house, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. The interior was spotless and simply furnished, everything worn but well cared for. He could see a rocking chair by the window, a sewing basket beside it overflowing with fabric and thread, a small kitchen table with 2 chairs, a fireplace with a pot hanging over banked coals. Everything spoke of a life lived carefully, with limited resources stretched to their maximum. Sarah set the quilt carefully on the rocking chair and bustled to the stove, stirring up the fire and setting a pot of coffee to heat. "Please sit down," she said, gesturing to the table. "I have some bread I baked yesterday and some jam." Jessie sat, feeling too large and awkward in the small space. He watched Sarah move around her kitchen, noting the grace in her movements, the efficiency of someone who had learned to do much with little. She set out cups and plates, sliced bread, and produced a jar of what looked like apricot preserves. "How far did you ride?" Sarah asked as she poured coffee, her hands steady now, though her eyes were still bright with emotion. "I work at the Broken Arrow Ranch," Jessie said. "Found the quilt yesterday evening near Bitter Creek. Rode into Esperanza this morning to ask around. Mrs. Henley at the general store told me it was yours." Sarah smiled. "Of course she did. Martha knows everything that happens in 3 counties. I am Sarah Whitmore, by the way. I do not think I properly introduced myself." "Jessie Tanner," he said. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Whitmore." "Please call me Sarah," she said, sitting across from him. "Anyone who rides 30 miles to return my most precious possession has certainly earned the right to use my first name." 30 miles, Jessie repeated. 15 miles there and 15 back, Sarah said. "That is 30 in total, is it not?" Jessie had not thought of it that way, but she was right. "I suppose so," he said. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking coffee and eating bread with jam. Jessie thought it was the best bread he had tasted in years, probably because Sarah had made it herself, with care, rather than the ranch cook, who made everything in huge quantities with efficiency rather than artistry. "Tell me about the quilt," Jessie said suddenly. "If you do not mind, Mrs. Henley said it was your grandmother's." Sarah's face softened. "My grandmother made it for her wedding in Tennessee in 1845. That burgundy fabric came from her wedding dress. The blue gingham was from my grandfather's favorite shirt. She pieced together all these bits of their lives into something beautiful and useful. They brought it west when they settled in Missouri, and then my mother brought it to Texas when my parents came here in 1867. I was 8 years old then." She paused, her fingers wrapping around her coffee cup. "My parents died 3 years ago in a fever epidemic. My brothers went to California, and my sister married and moved to San Antonio. This quilt was the one thing I had that connected me to, all of them, to all those years and all those stories. When the wind took it, I felt like I had lost my family all over again." Jessie felt a tightness in his throat. "I am sorry about your parents," he said quietly, "and I am glad I could bring the quilt back to you." Sarah looked at him with those deep brown eyes, and Jessie felt that strange sensation again, as though something fundamental had shifted in his world. "You are a good man, Jessie Tanner," she said softly. No one had ever said that to him quite that way before, with such simple sincerity, and Jesse found himself unable to form a response. He took a long drink of coffee to cover his confusion. "Do you have family?" Sarah asked after a moment. Jesse shook his head. "My father lost his ranch in New Mexico when I was 20. Drought killed the cattle, and the bank took the land. He died shortly after. My mother had passed years before that. I have been working different ranches ever since, never really settling anywhere." "That must be lonely," Sarah said, and there was understanding in her voice rather than pity, which Jesse appreciated. "I suppose it is," he admitted, "but I am not sure I would know what to do with roots if I had them." Sarah smiled slightly. "They are not so different from what you already have. You work hard, you care for things. You do what is right even when it is inconvenient. Those are the same things that make a person belong somewhere. You just need to find the right somewhere." They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing easily between them. Jesse told her about working at the Broken Arrow, about the challenges of ranching in the harsh landscape, about a particularly ornery bull that had kept the Cowboys busy for a week. Sarah told him about her sewing work, about the people in Esperanza, about how she was trying to keep her father's small garden producing vegetables despite limited water and constant wind. The sun was climbing toward noon when Jesse finally stood to leave, reluctant, but knowing he needed to get back to the ranch. Sarah walked him to the door, still clutching the quilt. "Thank you again," she said. "I truly cannot express how much this means to me." "I am just glad I found it," Jesse said. He settled his hat on his head and looked at her for a long moment, memorizing her face, knowing that something important had happened here today, even if he could not quite name what it was. "Take care, Sarah." "You too, Jesse," she said, and watched from the doorway as he mounted Rusty and rode away. Jesse made it about a mile down the road before he had to stop. He sat on his horse in the middle of nowhere, staring at the horizon, trying to understand what had just happened to him. In the space of a couple of hours, his entire sense of what he wanted from life had shifted. He had walked into that house a drifter with no particular plans beyond his next paycheck, and he had walked out a man who suddenly understood what he had been searching for all these years. He wanted to go back. He wanted to turn Rusty around and ride back to that small house and tell Sarah Whitmore that he would like to court her properly if she would have him. He wanted to see her smile again, wanted to watch her hands move through sewing work, wanted to hear her talk about her grandmother's quilt and her father's garden and everything else she thought and felt and cared about. But he could not just ride back there like some fool. He barely knew her. She had no reason to want him to court her. She probably thought he was just a cowboy doing a good deed, nothing more. Jesse forced himself to continue toward the ranch, but his mind stayed behind in that small house with those intelligent brown eyes and that warm, genuine smile. Sarah, standing in her doorway, watched until Jesse disappeared from view. Then she went inside and carefully spread the quilt across her bed, examining every inch for damage. The snag was minor and easily repaired. The dust would wash out. But more than the quilt's physical condition, Sarah found herself thinking about the man who had returned it. Jesse Tanner, a cowboy who had ridden 30 miles total to return something to a stranger, who had gray eyes that looked at her with startling directness, who had sat at her table and drunk her coffee and talked to her like she was someone interesting, rather than just the poor spinster seamstress. She found herself smiling as she traced the burgundy patches with her fingers, remembering how he had said the quilt was made with love and skill, how he had handled it so carefully, how he had seemed genuinely glad to return it to her. Sarah had learned not to let herself hope for things that seemed unlikely. Hope was a luxury she could rarely afford. But as she stood there with her grandmother's quilt safe in her hands and the memory of Jesse's kind eyes fresh in her mind, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. It felt dangerous and thrilling and terrifying all at once. It felt like possibility. The days that followed were strange for both of them. Jesse went about his work at the Broken Arrow with his usual diligence, but his thoughts kept drifting to Esperanza, to a small house with blue shutters, to a woman with brown eyes and capable hands. He found himself making excuses to ride near town, hoping he might catch a glimpse of Sarah, though he never saw her. The other ranch hands noticed his distraction and teased him about it, asking if he had met a girl in town, but Jesse kept silent and endured their ribbing with as much patience as he could muster. Sarah, meanwhile, threw herself into her work with renewed energy. She finished the christening gown and started on a new commission. a wedding dress for a young woman marrying a rancher's son. But in the quiet moments when her hands moved automatically through familiar stitches, her mind wandered to Jesse Tanner. She wondered what he was doing, whether he thought of her at all, whether she would ever see him again. 2 weeks passed. Then, on a Sunday afternoon, Sarah heard the sound of a horse approaching her house. She set down her sewing and went to the window, her heart suddenly beating fast. A rider was coming up the road, and even from a distance she recognized the bay gelding and the way the man sat in the saddle. Jesse had not planned this visit, or at least he had told himself he had not planned it. He had told himself he was just riding into town for supplies, and if he happened to go a bit out of his way past Sarah's house, well, that was just coincidence. But when he saw the small building with its blue shutters, he found his hands guiding Rusty up to the fence without any conscious decision on his part. Sarah opened the door before he could knock, and the smile on her face made Jesse's chest feel tight. "Hello," she said, and her voice sounded a little breathless, a little uncertain, but mostly pleased. "Hello," Jesse replied. "I was passing by and thought I would check that the quilt cleaned up all right." It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it, but Sarah nodded as though it made perfect sense. "It cleaned up beautifully," she said. "Would you like to come in and see?" Jesse dismounted and followed her inside, removing his hat as before. The quilt was indeed beautiful, spread across the back of the rocking chair, its colors vibrant and clean. "Looks good as new," Jesse said. "Thanks to you," Sarah said. She looked at him for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. "Would you like to stay for supper? It is nothing fancy, just stew and cornbread, but there is plenty." Jesse knew he should refuse. He had no business imposing on her hospitality again, but instead he heard himself say, "I would like that very much." Sarah smiled, that same warm, genuine smile that had haunted Jesse's thoughts for 2 weeks. "Good," she said simply. They fell into conversation as easily as they had before, as though the 2 weeks had been 2 minutes. Sarah moved around the kitchen preparing supper while they talked, and Jesse offered to help, feeling useless just sitting. She set him to work slicing bread, and they worked side by side in the small space, their movements becoming a kind of dance as they navigated around each other. The stew was excellent, rich with beef and vegetables from Sarah's garden. They ate at the small table as evening light slanted through the windows, turning everything golden. Jesse found himself telling Sarah things he had not told anyone, about his childhood in New Mexico, about watching his father slowly break under the weight of failure, about his own fear of putting down roots because roots could be torn up so easily. Sarah listened with complete attention, her brown eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she reached across the table and put her hand over his, a gesture of comfort and understanding. "Roots are not meant to trap you," she said quietly. "They are meant to give you a place to return to, a place where you belong. The right roots make you stronger, not weaker." Jesse turned his hand over so their palms met, and neither of them pulled away. They sat like that in the gathering dusk, hands clasped on the table, something profound passing between them without words. "I would like to court you," Jesse said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess them. "If that would be all right with you. I know I am just a ranch hand without much to offer, and you barely know me, but I cannot stop thinking about you, and I would really like the chance to see where this might go." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, joyful tears. "I would like that very much," she said. "I have been hoping you would come back." Jesse felt as though he might float right up out of his chair. "Really?" "Really," Sarah confirmed, squeezing his hand. "I have been thinking about you constantly since you brought back my quilt. You are kind and honest and thoughtful, and those are the things that matter most." They smiled at each other like fools, both of them giddy with the relief and excitement of discovering their feelings were mutual. Jesse stayed until full dark, talking and laughing with Sarah, reluctant to leave, but knowing he needed to get back to the ranch. When he finally stood to go, Sarah walked him to the door. "Can I come see you again next Sunday?" Jesse asked. "I would be disappointed if you did not," Sarah replied. Jesse mounted Rusty, looked back at Sarah, framed in the doorway with lamplight glowing behind her, and felt his heart swell with something that felt dangerously close to love, far too soon, but undeniable nonetheless. He touched his hat brim in farewell and rode into the night, already counting the days until Sunday. The courtship that followed was conducted with all the propriety and care that their situations demanded. Jesse rode to Sarah's house every Sunday after finishing his morning chores, arriving around noon and staying until evening. They took walks around her property, worked together in her garden, sat on her small porch and talked about everything and nothing. Jesse helped her repair the fence that surrounded her vegetable plot, fixed a broken hinge on her door, and replaced several rotted boards on the porch steps. Sarah mended his shirts, sewed new buttons on his vest, and cooked him meals that made him realize how much he had missed the comfort of home cooking. They attended church services in Esperanza together, which caused considerable talk among the townspeople. Martha Henley smiled knowingly every time she saw them. Thomas Yates, who had proposed to Sarah twice before, looked sour but said nothing. The minister's wife made a point of telling Sarah how lovely it was to see her stepping out with such a nice young man. As summer arrived and the temperature climbed, Jesse and Sarah found ways to stay cool, sitting in the shade of Sarah's house or taking evening walks when the worst heat had passed. They talked about their hopes and dreams, their fears and disappointments, the things that made them laugh and the things that made them sad. Jesse told Sarah about his dream of one day owning his own small ranch. Nothing fancy, just enough land for some cattle and horses, and a life built on his own terms. Sarah told Jesse about her hope of having a family someday, of filling her small house with children and laughter, of passing her grandmother's quilt down to her own daughter or granddaughter. By August, Jesse knew with absolute certainty that he wanted to marry Sarah Whitmore. He had never been so sure of anything in his life. She was everything he had not known he was searching for: intelligent, kind, resilient, funny, patient, and beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with mere physical appearance and everything to do with the light that seemed to shine from within her. When he was with Sarah, the restlessness that had driven him from place to place all these years simply vanished. He had found his somewhere, and it was wherever she was. The problem was that he had nothing to offer her. He was still just a ranch hand drawing $30 a month, living in a bunkhouse, owning little more than a horse, a saddle, and the clothes on his back. Sarah deserved better than that. She deserved a real home, security, a future that did not involve scraping by on sewing work and hope. Jesse began saving every penny he could, cutting back on already modest expenses, taking on extra work whenever possible. He approached Mr. Gray and asked if there were additional jobs he could do for extra pay. The rancher, who had noticed the change in Jesse over the summer and had heard about the courtship, gave him more responsibilities and a small raise. It was not much, but it was a start. In September, Jesse finally gathered his courage and talked to Mr. Gray about his future. They sat on the ranch house porch in the evening, and Jesse laid out his situation honestly. He wanted to marry Sarah, wanted to build a life with her, but he had almost nothing to his name. Mr. Gray listened carefully, then leaned back in his chair and studied Jesse for a long moment. "You are one of the best hands I have had in years," the rancher said finally. "Reliable, skilled, and honest. Those qualities are rare." He paused, considering. "I have a proposition for you. There is a line shack on the eastern edge of my property, near where you found that quilt. It has not been used in years and needs work, but the structure is sound. If you are willing to put in the labor to fix it up, you can live there rent-free. I will also give you a small piece of land around it, say 20 acres, that you can use as you see fit. Run a few cattle on shares with me, keep chickens, plant a garden, whatever makes sense. You will still work for the ranch, but you will have your own place to build on." Jesse felt as though he had been struck by lightning. "Mr. Gray, I do not know what to say." "Say yes," the rancher replied with a slight smile. "You have earned it, Jesse, and I would rather keep a good man happy and settled than watch him drift off looking for something better. Besides, I like the idea of having someone living out in that direction. Keeps an eye on things." Jesse accepted immediately, gratitude overwhelming him. That very evening, after he had finished his work for the day, he rode to Sarah's house even though it was not Sunday. He arrived near sunset and found her in her garden, pulling weeds in the long shadows. "Jesse," she said, surprised but clearly pleased to see him. "I was not expecting you today." Jesse dismounted and walked to her, taking both her hands in his. "Sarah Whitmore, I know I'm not much," he said, the words coming fast and urgent. "I am just a cowboy with more past than future, and you deserve someone who can give you the world. But I love you so much it feels like my chest cannot contain it all, and I want to marry you, if you will have me. Mr. Gray has given me land and a house to fix up. It is not much yet, but it could be. We could make it into something together. We could have the life we have talked about, the family you want, the home I have been searching for. Will you marry me, Sarah?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and for a terrible moment Jesse thought she was going to refuse. But then she was nodding, squeezing his hand so hard it almost hurt. "Yes," she said through her tears. "Yes, of course I will marry you. I love you too, Jesse. I think I have loved you since the moment you showed up at my door with my grandmother's quilt in your arms." Jesse pulled her into his embrace, holding her tight, feeling her arms wrap around his waist, and thought he had never been happier in his entire life. They stood there in the garden as the sun set and the first stars appeared, holding each other, making plans, dreaming out loud about their future together. They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Esperanza, on a cool October morning, with leaves turning gold on the few trees that grew near town. Sarah wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton that she had sewn herself, with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Jesse wore his best shirt and pants, his boots polished until they shone, his hair neatly trimmed for the occasion. Martha Henley and several other townspeople attended, along with some of the ranch hands from the Broken Arrow. Mr. Gray stood as Jesse's best man, and the minister's wife stood with Sarah. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. Jesse's voice shook slightly as he made his vows, promising to love and cherish Sarah for all his days. Sarah's voice was clear and strong, her brown eyes locked on Jesse's gray ones as she pledged her life to his. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jesse kissed Sarah gently, reverently, sealing promises that both of them intended to keep forever. After the ceremony, Martha Henley hosted a small celebration at her house behind the general store, with food and cider and a cake that Sarah had helped bake the day before. The gathering was modest but cheerful, full of well wishes and good-natured teasing. Jesse and Sarah endured it all with patience and good humor, though they were both eager to leave and begin their new life together. They had spent the previous month transforming the line shack into a home. It was small, just 2 rooms, but Jesse had worked on it every spare moment, repairing the roof, replacing broken windows, fixing the fireplace so it drew properly, building sturdy furniture from lumber Mr. Gray had provided. Sarah had scrubbed every surface until it gleamed, made curtains from fabric she had in her stores, and moved her most precious possessions to their new home. Her grandmother's quilt, her sewing basket, the few dishes and cooking implements she owned. Jesse had also moved Sarah's chickens to the new property, building a sturdy coop to keep them safe from predators, and had started a small herd of cattle on shares with Mr. Gray. It was the beginning of something, a foundation they could build on. When they finally left the celebration and rode to their home together, Sarah sitting in front of Jesse on Rusty with his arms around her, both of them felt the weight and wonder of the commitment they had just made. This was real. They were married. They were beginning a life together. That night, in their small house with her grandmother's quilt spread across their bed, Sarah and Jesse came together as husband and wife. It was tender and slightly awkward, as first times often are, but it was also filled with love and trust and a sense of rightness that made any awkwardness unimportant. Afterward, they lay wrapped in each other's arms beneath the quilt, talking quietly in the darkness, making more plans, dreaming more dreams. "I still cannot believe you rode 30 miles to return my quilt," Sarah murmured, her head on Jesse's chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Best 30 miles I ever rode," Jesse replied, his fingers gently stroking her hair. "Brought me everything I never knew I needed." Sarah tilted her head to look at him, her eyes soft in the dim moonlight, filtering through the window. "Do you really think we can make this work? Build a life here?" "I know we can," Jesse said with conviction. "We both know how to work hard. We both know how to make something from nothing. And we have each other. That is more than enough." Sarah smiled and kissed him softly. "You are right," she said. "It is more than enough. It is everything." The first year of their marriage was not easy, but it was good. They worked from sunrise to sunset, building their small ranch and their life together. Jesse continued working for the Broken Arrow, while also tending his own cattle and making improvements to their property. Sarah continued her sewing work, bringing in needed income, while also managing their household, tending chickens in a garden, and learning to cook on a wood stove that had a temperamental personality. They faced challenges. A harsh winter brought snow and bitter cold that tested their resources and endurance. Jesse spent long days making sure the cattle survived, while Sarah struggled to keep their small house warm enough. But they persevered together, drawing strength from each other. In the spring, they celebrated their first anniversary by planting fruit trees on their property, apple and peach saplings that would take years to mature but represented their faith in the future. That same spring, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure. A child was what they wanted more than almost anything, but it also represented new responsibilities and vulnerabilities. Jesse became almost obsessively protective, worrying about Sarah constantly, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work. Sarah tolerated his concern with patience and gentle humor, reminding him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, and she was perfectly capable of continuing her normal activities within reason. As summer arrived and Sarah's belly grew round, Jesse found himself overwhelmed with emotions he had never experienced before. He would lie in bed at night with his hand on Sarah's stomach, feeling the baby kick and move, and be struck by the enormity of what they had created together. This was a new life, a person who would be part both of him and Sarah, who would carry their combined hopes and dreams into the future. In late August, as the heat shimmered across the landscape, Sarah went into labor. Jesse rode frantically to Esperanza to fetch the midwife, an experienced woman named Mrs. Potter who had delivered most of the babies in the area for the past 20 years. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning. Jesse paced outside the bedroom, feeling helpless and terrified, listening to Sarah's cries and praying harder than he ever had in his life. But when Mrs. Potter finally opened the door and told him he had a son and that Sarah was tired but well, Jesse felt his knees go weak with relief. He entered the bedroom to find Sarah propped up on pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the squares she had cut from her grandmother's quilt to make baby clothes. "Meet your son," Sarah said softly, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. Jesse approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe, and looked down at the impossibly small face nestled in the fabric. The baby had a downy covering of dark hair and eyes that were trying to focus on the world around him. Jesse reached out with one calloused finger and gently touched the baby's cheek, amazed by the softness of the skin. "He is perfect," Jesse whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "He is," Sarah agreed. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names but had never quite decided. Now, looking at his son, Jesse thought of his own father, who had worked himself to exhaustion, trying to hold on to a dream. He thought of Sarah's father, who had built this land from nothing and raised a daughter with strength and grace. "What was your father's name?" Jesse asked. "William," Sarah said. "William James Whitmore." "William James Tanner," Jesse said, testing the name. "Will for short. What do you think?" Sarah smiled. "I think it is perfect. Welcome to the world, William James Tanner. We are so glad you are here." Baby Will proved to be a healthy, hungry infant who demanded attention at all hours. Jesse and Sarah stumbled through those early weeks in a haze of exhaustion and wonder, learning how to care for this new person who had so completely upended their lives. Jesse found himself waking before dawn, not because he had work to do, but because he wanted to watch his son sleep, to marvel at the tiny perfection of his fingers and toes, to be present for every moment of this new life. Sarah, despite her exhaustion, seemed to glow with happiness. She nursed Will while sitting in her rocking chair, the same chair where she had once done her sewing, and sang him lullabies her mother had sung to her. Jesse would come in from working to find them like that, mother and son together in the afternoon light, and feel his heart swell with love so intense it was almost painful. The years that followed were full and rich, though never easy. Jesse and Sarah worked hard to build their ranch into something viable. Their small herd grew slowly but steadily. They added more chickens, then some pigs, then a milk cow. Jesse became Mr. Gray's foreman at the Broken Arrow, which came with more responsibility, but also better pay. Sarah's reputation as a skilled seamstress spread, and she had more work than she could handle, sometimes staying up late by lamplight to finish commissions. Will grew from a baby to a curious toddler who got into everything, then to a sturdy little boy who followed his father everywhere, wanting to help with all the ranch work. Jesse taught him to ride before he was 5, sitting him on a gentle old mare and leading her around the corral while Will shrieked with delight. When Will was 3, Sarah became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier and the labor shorter. and in the spring of 1886, they welcomed a daughter they named Grace Elizabeth after both of their mothers. Grace was a quieter baby than Will had been, with Sarah's brown eyes and Jessie's sandy hair, and she seemed content to observe the world with solemn attention. 2 years after Grace came another son, Henry Fletcher, named after Mr. Gray, who had become like a father to Jessie. Henry was boisterous and energetic from birth, keeping Sarah constantly busy trying to keep him out of trouble. Their small house had grown too small for their expanding family, so Jessie built an addition, adding 2 more rooms and a larger kitchen. It was rough work done in stolen hours between his regular responsibilities, but slowly the house took shape, becoming something substantial and solid. Sarah made curtains for the new windows and sewn quilts for the children's beds, teaching Grace how to make simple stitches even though the girl was only 4 years old. Life was full of work and challenges, but it was also full of love and laughter and the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful together. Jessie and Sarah would sometimes sit on their porch in the evenings after the children were asleep, holding hands and watching the stars, marveling at how far they had come from that day when the wind had stolen a quilt and brought them together. "Do you remember how nervous you were when you knocked on my door that first time?" Sarah asked one such evening, a smile in her voice. Jessie chuckled. "I thought I was going to drop the quilt or say something stupid. I could barely string 2 words together." "You did fine," Sarah assured him. "You were kind and gentle and careful with something that mattered to me. That told me everything I needed to know about who you were." "I knew the moment I saw you," Jessie said quietly, "standing in that doorway, and something in me just recognized you, like I had been looking for you my whole life without knowing it." Sarah squeezed his hand. "I felt it too," she admitted. "It terrified me. I had convinced myself I would live alone forever, that it was safer not to hope for anything else. And then you appeared with my quilt and everything changed." "Best windstorm that ever blew through Texas," Jessie said, making Sarah laugh. "The quilt is getting worn," Sarah said after a moment, her tone more serious. "I have mended it so many times. I am not sure how much longer it will last." "Then we will make new quilts," Jessie said. "We will teach Grace and any daughters who come after how to sew, how to create beautiful things that last. The quilt brought us together, but our love is what keeps us together. That does not wear out." Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him, the steady presence that had become the center of her world. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too," Jessie replied. "Every single day, more than the day before." When Will was 10, Grace was 7, and Henry was 5, Sarah discovered she was pregnant once more. This pregnancy was harder than the others had been. She was 36 now, and her body did not bounce back from the demands of carrying a child the way it had when she was younger. Jessie worried constantly, trying to take on more of the household work, insisting Sarah rest whenever possible. The baby arrived in early December, a bitterly cold day when the wind howled across the prairie like something wild and angry. It was another difficult labor, and there were moments when Jessie feared he might lose both Sarah and the baby. But Mrs. Potter was as skilled as ever, and after hours that felt like years, Sarah delivered a second daughter. They named her Rose because despite being born in the midst of winter's harshness, she was as beautiful and perfect as a flower in spring. Rose had Jessie's gray eyes and dark hair like Will, and from the beginning, she had a sweet, gentle temperament that made everyone who met her smile. With 4 children, their lives became even more chaotic and full. The house that had seemed spacious with 3 children felt cramped with 4. Jessie began planning another addition, but there was never enough time or money to tackle such a large project immediately. They made do, as they always had, finding creative solutions to space problems and teaching the children to share and cooperate. Will proved to have a natural talent for working with animals, especially horses. By the time he was 12, he could gentle a Greenbroke horse better than most of the experienced hands at the Broken Arrow. Mr. Gray started bringing Will along on cattle drives during the summer, paying him a small wage and teaching him the business. Jessie swelled with pride watching his son develop skills and confidence, seeing him grow toward manhood. Grace had inherited her mother's talent with a needle and thread. She could create delicate embroidery that rivaled Sarah's work, and she loved to design her own patterns. She also had a head for numbers and helped keep track of the ranch accounts, which Sarah had been managing since the beginning. At 9 years old, she could calculate profit margins and budget expenses better than most grown men, Henry was the wild one, always climbing things he should not climb, always exploring places he should not explore, always asking questions that had no simple answers. He kept them all on their toes, but his exuberance and joy were infectious. He made everyone laugh, even when they were exhausted and frustrated. And Rose, as she grew from baby to toddler, proved to be the peacemaker of the family, the one who could soothe hurt feelings and settle disputes between her siblings with her gentle words and intuitive understanding. The years rolled on, bringing both joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle. Mr. Gray died when Will was 15, leaving the Broken Arrow to his nephew, a difficult man from back east who knew nothing about ranching and cared less. Jesse chafed under the new management, and for the first time in years, he began to seriously consider striking out on his own entirely. He and Sarah discussed it long into many nights. They had saved carefully over the years, and their own small herd had grown to a respectable size. They owned their land outright, the 20 acres Mr. Gray had given them, plus another 40 they had purchased over time. It was not a large ranch by any measure, but it was enough to support them if they were careful and worked hard. The decision was made easier when the new owner of the Broken Arrow announced he was bringing in his own foreman and cutting back staff. Jesse could stay on as a regular hand at reduced wages, or he could leave. Jesse chose to leave, finally ready to bet everything on his own ranch, his own dream. It was frightening, giving up the security of regular pay, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time since arriving in Texas, Jesse was his own boss, answering to no one but himself and his family. He threw himself into building the ranch, working harder than ever before. Will worked beside him, nearly a man now at 15, strong and capable. Even Henry, only 10, did his share, helping with the horses and cattle in ways appropriate for his age. Sarah managed the household and continued her sewing work, which had become even more profitable over the years. Women from miles around sought her out for special garments, wedding dresses and christening gowns, and quilts commissioned for significant occasions. She trained Grace in the skills, and mother and daughter worked side by side, creating beautiful things while Rose played at their feet. The ranch slowly grew more successful. Jesse had a good eye for cattle, and an even better eye for horses. He began breeding horses specifically for ranch work, developing a reputation for selling mounts that were smart, sturdy, and well-trained. Ranchers from across the region started seeking out Tanner horses, willing to pay premium prices for animals they knew they could trust. By the time Will was 20, the ranch was profitable enough to support them comfortably, with some left over to save for the future. Will had grown into a fine young man, tall and lean like his father, with Jesse's quiet competence and Sarah's warm heart. He began courting a girl from Esperanza, the daughter of the new minister, and Jesse and Sarah watched with knowing smiles, recognizing the same intensity of feeling they had experienced themselves all those years ago. Grace, at 17, had received multiple marriage proposals but had turned them all down, declaring she was in no hurry to leave home. She was content working with her mother and helping manage the ranch finances, and she seemed genuinely happy with her life as it was. Sarah respected her daughter's independence, never pushing her toward marriage, knowing Grace would make her own choices in her own time. Henry, at 15, was attending school in Esperanza during the winter months, boarding with Martha Henley, who would become like a grandmother to all the Tanner children. Henry had dreams of becoming a lawyer, which seemed improbable for a ranch boy from nowhere, Texas. But Jesse and Sarah encouraged him to pursue education and see where it led. They had learned that dreams, no matter how unlikely, were worth chasing. Rose, at 11, was growing into a lovely young woman with her father's eyes and her mother's grace. She loved helping with the animals and had a special gift for nursing sick or injured creatures back to health. She talked about becoming a veterinarian, another improbable dream for a girl in 1897. But Jesse and Sarah told her the same thing they told Henry: get as much education as possible and see what doors might open. On a warm evening in May of that year, Jesse and Sarah celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary. The children had planned a special supper, with Will and Grace doing the cooking, while Henry and Rose decorated the house with wildflowers they had gathered. The family sat around the table that Jesse had built so many years ago in their original tiny house, now battered and scarred from years of use but still solid, and ate and laughed and told stories. After supper, Jesse produced a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, presenting it to Sarah with a slightly nervous smile. "I made you something," he said. It is not as fine as what you could make yourself, but I wanted to try. Sarah unwrapped the package carefully and found herself looking at a quilt. It was rough work, the stitches uneven and the squares not perfectly aligned, but it was made with love so obvious it brought tears to her eyes. Jesse had pieced together fabric from shirts he had worn, from Sarah's old dresses, from the children's outgrown clothes, creating a patchwork history of their family. "Jesse," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "This is beautiful." "I wanted to make you a new quilt," Jesse said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Your grandmother's quilt is so worn now, and I know how much it means to you, and I thought maybe we could start a new tradition? Maybe we could make quilts together, preserving pieces of our lives, and pass them down to our children and their children." Sarah set the quilt aside and threw her arms around her husband, holding him tight while tears streamed down her face. "It is perfect," she said. "You are perfect. This whole life we have built together is perfect." "I would not go that far," Jesse said with a laugh. "We have had plenty of hard times." "But we have had them together," Sarah said, pulling back to look at him. "That makes all the difference. Every challenge, every triumph, every ordinary day. We have faced it all side by side. That is what makes life perfect. Not the absence of problems, but the presence of someone you love, standing beside you through everything." The children watched their parents with varying degrees of understanding and embarrassment, but underneath the typical adolescent discomfort with parental displays of affection, they were all aware of how lucky they were. Their friends at school and church often had parents who barely spoke to each other, who seemed to coexist out of obligation rather than genuine partnership. The Tanner children had grown up surrounded by love, seeing their parents' affection for each other demonstrated every single day, and it had shaped them in ways they would not fully understand until they were adults themselves. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Jesse and Sarah sat on their porch wrapped in the quilt Jesse had made, looking at the stars scattered across the enormous Texas sky. The house was quiet behind them, full of sleeping children who were the proof and product of their love. The ranch land stretched out in all directions, 60 acres that belonged to them, that they had built into something viable through years of unrelenting work and stubborn determination. "Do you ever think about that day?" Sarah asked softly. "The day the wind took my grandmother's quilt?" "I think about it all the time," Jesse admitted. "I think about how easily I might have ridden right past it, or decided it was not my business to return it, or any number of other choices that would have meant we never met. It terrifies me, how close I came to missing out on this entire life." "But you did not ride past it," Sarah said. "You saw something that needed doing, and you did it. That is who you are, Jesse. That is why I fell in love with you." "I fell in love with you the moment you opened your door," Jesse said. "Looking at you holding that quilt, crying because you had thought it was lost forever, I knew I had found something I had been searching for my entire life." Sarah smiled in the darkness. "A crying woman holding a dusty quilt? That was what you were searching for?" Jesse laughed. "When you say it like that, it sounds ridiculous. But yes, in a way, I was searching for someone genuine and real, someone who cared deeply about things that mattered, someone who had faced loss and hardship, but had not let it make them bitter. I was searching for home, and home turned out to be wherever you were." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from years of knowing another person so completely that words become optional. In the distance, a coyote called and another answered. The wind stirred gently through the grass, carrying the scent of mesquite and sage. It was a peaceful moment, unremarkable in many ways, but also profound in its simplicity. "I want to add something to my quilt," Sarah said suddenly. "Your grandmother's quilt has served us well, but you are right that it is time for new quilts. I want to make one that tells our whole story, from the day we met until now. I want pieces from everything important, my wedding dress, your work shirts, the children's baby clothes, fabric from this house, everything. And I want to teach the girls how to make their own family quilts when the time comes." "I think that is a wonderful idea," Jessie said, squeezing her hand. "And I want to keep your quilt exactly as it is," Sarah continued, "with all its imperfect stitches and uneven squares, because it is perfect in the ways that matter. It is made with love, just like our life together." Jessie kissed her temple gently. "Just like our life together," he agreed. The years continued to unfold, bringing changes and growth. Will married his minister's daughter in a lovely ceremony in Esperanza, and they settled on land adjacent to Jesse and Sarah's ranch, building their own house and starting their own herd. Within a year, Will and his wife had their first child, making Jesse and Sarah grandparents for the first time. The baby was a girl they named Sarah Jane, and watching Jesse hold his granddaughter with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, Sarah fell in love with him all over again. Grace eventually did marry, though not until she was 23. She chose a teacher who had come to Esperanza from Austin, a quiet man with a love of books and a profound respect for Grace's intelligence. They settled in town, where he taught school, and she continued her sewing work, creating pieces that became treasured family heirlooms for people throughout the region. Henry achieved his improbable dream, earning a scholarship to study law in Austin. He would return to Esperanza years later to set up practice, becoming a voice for justice in their corner of Texas, and making his parents proud beyond measure. Rose proved to have a remarkable gift for healing animals, and when a veterinarian passing through Esperanza fell ill, Rose nursed both him and his injured horse back to health. Impressed by her skill and passion, he offered to take her on as an apprentice. It was unusual, almost unheard of, for a woman to work as a veterinarian, but Rose was determined and talented enough to overcome prejudice through sheer competence. Through all these changes, Jesse and Sarah remained constants for each other and for their family. Their love, far from fading with time, seemed only to deepen and strengthen. They knew each other's thoughts before they were spoken, could communicate with a glance, had developed the kind of partnership that made them more than the sum of their individual parts. On their 25th wedding anniversary, in the autumn of 1907, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. All 4 children were there with their own families now. Grandchildren ran everywhere, filling the house and yard with noise and laughter. The ranch had grown and prospered, now encompassing over 200 acres and supporting not just Jesse and Sarah, but Will's family as well, with Henry and Grace contributing financially and Rose sending money when she could from her veterinary work. Sarah was 48 now, her dark hair threaded with silver, lines etched around her eyes and mouth from years of squinting into the sun and smiling at her family. But she was still beautiful to Jesse, still the woman who had stolen his heart that first moment in her doorway. She moved with the same grace, spoke with the same intelligence, loved with the same generous heart. Jesse was 51, his body bearing the marks of hard physical labor, scarred hands, a back that ached on cold mornings, skin weathered to leather by sun and wind. But he was still strong, still capable, still devoted completely to his wife and family. The celebration was loud and joyous, with food and music and stories told and retold. When things finally quieted down in the evening and the children were settled, Jesse and Sarah slipped away to their porch, the place where they had spent so many evenings over the years. 25 years, Sarah marveled, leaning against Jesse's shoulder. A quarter of a century. Best 25 years anyone could ask for, Jesse replied. Not all easy years, Sarah reminded him. No, but all good ones, Jesse said. Even the hard times were good because we faced them together. Sarah thought about all they had been through, the struggles to build the ranch, the times when money was desperately tight, the childhood illnesses that had terrified them, the droughts and storms, and all the uncertainties that came with ranching. But Jesse was right. Even the difficult times had been good in their own way, because they had revealed strengths neither of them knew they possessed and had bound them closer together. "Do you still have my grandmother's quilt?" Sarah asked. "Of course," Jesse said. "It is in the trunk at the foot of our bed, where it has been for years." "I think I want to get it out," Sarah said. "We have been so careful with it, trying to preserve it. But what is the point of preservation if we never use it? Let us sleep under it tonight, like we did on our wedding night." They retrieved the quilt, handling it gently but without excessive worry. It was fragile now, worn thin in places, but still beautiful. That night they lay beneath it as they had 25 years ago, and the memories washed over them, young and nervous and so full of hope, not knowing what the future would bring, but certain they wanted to face it together. "I would do it all again," Sarah whispered in the darkness, "every single moment exactly the same." "Even the day the wind stole your quilt?" Jesse teased gently. "Especially that day," Sarah said firmly, "because that was the day you came into my life. That was the day everything changed. That wind was not stealing something from me. It was bringing me everything I would ever need." Jessie pulled her close, feeling her warmth, her presence, the miracle of her existence in his life. "I rode 30 miles that day," he said. "It seemed like a long way then, but I would have ridden 30,000 miles if that was what it took to find you." Sarah turned to face him, able to see his features dimly in the moonlight, filtering through their window. She touched his cheek gently, feeling the roughness of his beard, the solidity of his presence. "We found each other," she said simply. "However it happened, whatever forces brought us together, we found each other and we built this beautiful life. That is all that matters." They made love that night with the tenderness and familiarity of long practice, their bodies knowing each other as well as their minds did. It was not the passionate urgency of youth, but something deeper and more profound. The physical expression of a love that had been tested and proven over decades, that had produced children and grandchildren, that had survived everything life could throw at it and emerged stronger. Afterward, wrapped in each other and the fragile quilt, they drifted to sleep, feeling complete in ways they had never felt before they found each other. The years continued, as years do. Jessie and Sarah grew older, their pace slowing, their bodies showing the inevitable wear of time and hard use. But their minds remained sharp and their love remained strong. They watched their grandchildren grow, celebrated marriages and births, mourned losses when they came. They remained the center of their family, the example everyone looked to, the proof that love and commitment and hard work could build something lasting. On a spring morning in 1920, Jessie and Sarah sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. Jessie was 63 now, Sarah 60. They had been married for 38 years, together for 39. The ranch was thriving under Will's management, though Jessie still helped out when he could. Sarah had finally retired from taking sewing commissions, her eyes no longer sharp enough for the detailed work, though she still made quilts for family members and taught her granddaughters the craft. "I have been thinking," Jessie said, breaking their comfortable silence, "about that quilt, your grandmother's quilt." "What about it?" Sarah asked. "I think we should give it to Sarah Jane," Jessie said, referring to their oldest grandchild, now a young woman of 20 preparing to marry. "Start the tradition fresh. Your grandmother made it for her wedding. Your mother passed it to you. You should pass it to your namesake." Sarah considered this for a long moment. The quilt had been through so much, carried across states, stolen by wind, recovered through a stranger's kindness, used through decades of marriage, preserved as a treasure. It was fragile now, barely holding together despite Sarah's careful mending over the years. But Jessie was right. It should be passed down, should continue its journey through their family. "I think that is perfect," Sarah agreed. "We will give it to her as a wedding gift, along with the story of how it brought us together. And we will make sure she knows," Jessie added, "that the most important thing is not the quilt itself, but what it represents. Family, love, connection across time. The willingness to ride 30 miles for someone you have never met, just because it is the right thing to do." Sarah reached over and took his hand, their fingers interlacing automatically, a gesture repeated so many times over so many years that it required no thought. "You are a good man, Jesse Tanner," she said, echoing words she had spoken to him nearly 40 years ago in her small kitchen. "You were a good man then, and you are a good man now." "I had a good reason to be good," Jessie replied. "You made me want to be worthy of you." "You always were worthy," Sarah said softly. "From the very first moment." They sat holding hands, watching the sun climb higher in the endless Texas sky, feeling the warmth on their faces, listening to the sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing, horses nickering, grandchildren laughing somewhere in the distance. This was their life, built from a chance encounter and a wind-stolen quilt, constructed piece by piece through decades of love and work and unwavering commitment. Sarah Jane's wedding took place in June, a beautiful ceremony that filled the church in Esperanza to capacity. When Jessie and Sarah presented her with the quilt and told her the story of its journey and how it had brought them together, there was not a dry eye in the room. The young woman accepted it reverently, promising to care for it and pass it down to her own daughter someday, continuing the tradition. As Jessie and Sarah watched their granddaughter marry her sweetheart, they thought about their own wedding day 38 years before, how young and uncertain they had been, how impossible it had seemed that they could build anything lasting from such humble beginnings. Yet here they were, surrounded by the proof of their love, children and grandchildren, a thriving ranch, a marriage that had weathered everything and emerged triumphant. The years that followed were gentle ones, a gradual winding down rather than an abrupt ending. Jesse and Sarah remained active and engaged with their family, though they left the heavy work to younger generations. They spent their days together, talking and reminiscing, taking slow walks around the property, sitting on their porch watching the world go by. Jesse's health began to fail when he was 68. His heart, weakened by decades of physical labor, started giving him trouble. The doctor in Esperanza, a young man who seemed impossibly youthful to Jesse, told him to take it easy, to avoid stress and heavy work. Jesse complied as much as his nature would allow, but he chafed at the restrictions, frustrated by his body's betrayal. Sarah nursed him with patient devotion, making sure he followed the doctor's orders, preparing special foods that might help, sitting with him during the nights when his heart raced and skipped beats and frightened them both. She had nursed him through various injuries and illnesses over the years, but this felt different, more serious, more final. On a warm evening in September 1925, Jesse and Sarah sat on their porch watching the sunset. Jesse had been feeling poorly all day, his heart acting up, but he refused to stay in bed when the weather was so beautiful. Sarah sat close beside him, her hand in his, both of them quiet as they watched the sky turn orange and pink and purple. "Sarah," Jesse said softly, and something in his tone made her turn to look at him sharply. "What is wrong?" she asked, fear clutching at her chest. "Nothing is wrong," Jesse assured her, squeezing her hand. "I just want to tell you something. I want you to know that these 44 years with you have been the greatest gift of my life. If I had to do it all over again, I would not change a single thing. Well, maybe I would have built you a bigger house sooner," he added with a slight smile. "Jesse, do not talk like that," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "You are going to be fine. The doctor said if you rest and take care of yourself—" "Sarah," Jesse interrupted gently, "I am not afraid. I have lived a good life, a full life, a life filled with more love than most men ever know. If my time is coming soon, I am ready. My only regret would be leaving you." Tears streamed down Sarah's face. "You are not leaving me," she said fiercely. "We still have years left. We are going to see more grandchildren, maybe great-grandchildren. We are going to sit on this porch and grow old together. You promised me forever, Jesse Tanner, and I am holding you to that promise." Jesse smiled, that same gentle smile that had stolen Sarah's heart so many years ago. "Forever does not mean our bodies last forever," he said. "It means our love lasts forever. And it will, Sarah. No matter what happens to me, my love for you will never die. It will live on in our children and grandchildren, in this ranch we built together, in every memory you carry. That is forever." Sarah could not speak through her tears. She just held his hand and prayed harder than she had ever prayed for anything, begging whatever powers might be listening to let her keep him, to not take him from her, to give them more time. But prayers are not always answered the way we want them to be. That night, lying in bed with Sarah curled against his side, Jesse's heart simply stopped. He slipped away quietly in his sleep, no pain, no struggle, just a gentle transition from being to not being. Sarah woke in the pre-dawn darkness to find him gone, his body still warm but empty of the spirit that had animated it. Her scream brought the entire household running. Will and his family, who lived in the house next door, Grace and Henry, who had been staying for a visit. They found Sarah cradling Jesse's body, rocking back and forth, making a sound of grief so raw and primal it barely seemed human. The days that followed were a blur of arrangements and condolences, of people streaming through the house, bringing food and flowers and awkward sympathy. The funeral was enormous, attended by what seemed like everyone in 3 counties. Jesse had been respected and liked, known as a fair man who kept his word and helped his neighbors when they needed it. They buried him on a hill on the ranch, under an oak tree where he used to sit and watch the cattle. Sarah stood at the graveside holding Will's arm, dry-eyed and silent, feeling as though something vital had been torn out of her chest, leaving a wound that would never heal. The weeks after the funeral were the hardest of Sarah's life, harder even than losing her parents, because at least then she had had Jesse to lean on. Now there was nothing, just an emptiness that seemed to swallow everything. She moved through her days mechanically, doing what needed to be done but feeling nothing, as though she were watching herself from a distance. Her children worried about her. Will wanted her to move in with his family, but Sarah refused. She could not leave the house she and Jesse had built together, could not abandon the place where they had loved and laughed and raised their family. She needed to be surrounded by his presence, by memories of him in every room. Gradually, very gradually, the sharp agony of grief dulled to a persistent ache. Sarah began to function more normally, though she would never be the same person she had been when Jesse was alive. Part of her had died with him, and she accepted that as the price of having loved so deeply. She found comfort in her children and grandchildren, in the continuation of life even in the face of death. She found purpose in teaching her granddaughters to sew and quilt, passing down skills and stories. She found peace in sitting on her porch in the evenings, talking to Jesse as though he were still beside her, telling him about her day, sharing her thoughts and feelings. On what would have been their 45th wedding anniversary, Sarah took out the quilt Jesse had made for her 15 years earlier. She spread it on her bed and lay down on top of it, closing her eyes and remembering. She thought about the day they met, about Jesse standing on her doorstep, holding her grandmother's quilt. She thought about their wedding day, about the births of their children, about thousands of ordinary moments that had made up their extraordinary life together. "I miss you," she whispered to the empty room. "I miss you so much it feels like I cannot breathe sometimes. But I am grateful too. Grateful for every moment we had. Grateful for the family we created. Grateful that I got to love you and be loved by you. You were right that forever does not mean our bodies last forever. But our love does. It is still here, still strong, still the foundation everything else is built on." Sarah lived for another 12 years, dying peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72. In those years, she saw her family continue to grow and thrive. She held great-grandchildren, attended more weddings, celebrated the successes of children and grandchildren. She remained sharp and engaged until nearly the end, still making quilts, still telling stories, still the matriarch everyone looked to for wisdom and guidance. When she died, her family buried her beside Jesse on the hill, under the oak tree. They placed both quilts in her coffin, her grandmother's fragile wedding quilt and the rougher one Jesse had made, symbols of where their love had started and how it had grown. The whole family gathered for the funeral, 3 generations whose very existence was proof of Jesse and Sarah's love. Sarah Jane, now a grandmother herself, spoke at the funeral. She told the story of the quilt that the wind had stolen, of the cowboy who had ridden 30 miles to return it, of the love that had bloomed from that chance encounter and had lasted until death and beyond. She spoke of how that single act of kindness had rippled outward across decades, creating a family tree that would continue to grow and branch for generations. "My great-grandmother used to tell me," Sarah Jane said, "that the most important things in life are not bought or sold, inherited or stolen. The most important things are chosen. The love we choose to give, the commitments we choose to keep, the kindness we choose to show, even when it is inconvenient. My great-grandfather chose to spend a day returning a lost quilt. That choice changed everything, not just for him and my great-grandmother, but for all of us who exist because of their love." She paused, looking around at the assembled family. "They taught us what it means to build a life with someone, to face challenges together, to love through all circumstances. They taught us that forever is not just a word, but a promise that can be kept if we are willing to work at it. And they taught us that sometimes the best things in life come from unexpected places, from windstorms and lost quilts and strangers who care enough to ride 30 miles just to do the right thing." There were tears and smiles, grief and gratitude mingled together as they said goodbye to Sarah. But there was also a sense of completion, of a story well told, of a life fully lived. Jesse and Sarah had been given 44 years together, which was not as many as they might have wanted, but was more than many people ever got. And they had filled those years with so much love, so much meaning, so much purpose that the impact echoed far beyond their own lives. The ranch continued to thrive under Will's stewardship and eventually passed to his sons. The land that Jesse and Sarah had worked so hard to build into something viable supported generations of their descendants. The house where they had lived and loved remained standing, renovated and updated, but still fundamentally the same, still home to tanners who carried Jesse and Sarah's genes and values. And on quiet evenings when the wind stirred across the Texas grassland, family members sitting on that same porch where Jesse and Sarah had spent so many hours would sometimes swear they could feel a presence, could sense 2 people sitting close together, holding hands, watching the sunset together as they had done for 4 decades. Some said it was just imagination, but others knew better. Some kinds of love do not die when bodies die. Some kinds of love become part of the land itself, woven into the earth and air and continuing forever. The quilts, both of them, were eventually placed in a trunk and designated as family heirlooms, too fragile now for regular use, but too precious to discard. Each generation learned their story, learned about the wind and the cowboy, and the love that had blossomed from an act of simple kindness. The quilts became symbols of what the family stood for: perseverance, love, commitment, and the understanding that sometimes the smallest gestures can have the most profound consequences. And occasionally, when a young person in the family faced a difficult decision or felt uncertain about the future, an older relative would take them aside and tell them about their great-great-grandparents. They would tell the story of Sarah hanging her precious quilt on a clothesline, of wind stealing it away, of Jesse finding it miles from anywhere and choosing to spend a day returning it to a stranger. They would tell about how that single choice had created a love story that spanned decades and generations. Remember, they would say, that your choices matter, that kindness matters, that sometimes the things we think we have lost are actually leading us to exactly where we need to be. That love, real love, is worth any effort, any sacrifice, any challenge, and that the best things in life often come from the most unexpected places, from storms that seem to take things away, but are actually bringing us everything we need. And so, the story continued, passing from generation to generation. A reminder that in the Wild West of 1882, on a windy April day, a woman lost a quilt and gained a soulmate, and a cowboy rode 30 miles and found the home he had been searching for all his life. It was a simple story in many ways, but it was also epic, a testament to the power of choice and chance and love to transform ordinary lives into something extraordinary. The wind still blows across the Texas grassland, stirring through oak trees and mesquite, carrying the scent of sage and the sound of cattle. And if you listen carefully on certain evenings, you might hear echoes of laughter, of conversations, of two people who loved each other so completely that their love became eternal, outlasting their physical presence and becoming part of the very fabric of the land they worked and the family they created. That is the end of the story, but it is also just the beginning, because stories like this never truly end. They continue forward through time, carried by descendants who embody the values their ancestors lived by, who understand that love and commitment and kindness are not old-fashioned ideas but timeless truths that every generation must rediscover and reclaim for themselves. Jesse rode 30 miles that day in 1882, but in truth, he rode much farther than that, forward through time, into the future, carrying with him a love so strong it would echo across more than a century, inspiring generations yet unborn, proving that some things really do last forever if we choose to build them on foundations of genuine love, mutual respect, unwavering commitment, and the simple courage to do the right thing even when it is inconvenient. And that, more than anything else, is what Sarah and Jesse's story teaches us. That love is not just a feeling, but a choice, renewed day after day, year after year, through circumstances good and bad. That the smallest acts of kindness can have consequences beyond our ability to imagine. That home is not a place but a person. And when you find the right person, you have found everything you will ever need. And that sometimes, just sometimes, the wind knows exactly what it is doing when it steals a quilt from a clothesline and sets in motion events that will change lives for generations to come. Their love story began with a gust of wind and ended with peaceful deaths after decades of partnership. But the love itself never ended, never diminished, never faded. It simply transformed, becoming something larger than two individuals, becoming the foundation for a family, a legacy, a reminder that in this often harsh and difficult world, love remains the greatest force we have, the thing that makes all the struggle and pain worthwhile, the thing that gives life meaning and purpose and beauty beyond measure. And on that hill in Texas, under the oak tree where two headstones stand side by side, the wind still blows gently, respectfully, as though acknowledging its role in one of the greatest love stories the American West has ever known.